Executive Director of the Center. And here with me today, from Baltimore originally?
No, I'm
We have a new Images and Expressions Society who nominated Lizette Woodworth Reese, who is a longtime educator and famous poet.
drops those things that are foreign
for
to us.
candidates, or was it for? The current executive director of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and I'm thrilled today to have our two founding mothers with us today, and we're going to have a chance to talk and reminisce about the founding of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center and so many of the special stories that we've come to learn over the years. And we don't want you to forget any of these stories. So Jill Moss-Greenberg, who again a founder, but she was also serving as the first executive director, and she is now the executive director emerita. And Linda Shevitz, retired from the Maryland State Department of Education and also a co-founder, and was a member of the board for many, many years. So good afternoon. So why don't we go back to the very beginning? And Jill, I know you were there in the very beginning as well. So how did this brainchild come to happen?
Well, it's an interesting story because I never liked history. When I went to school, we learned about wars and battles. We had to memorize chronological dates of those battles. And I found that very uninteresting. It wasn't appealing. I never saw anyone who looked like me, and certainly never learned about society. I learned about wars for the most part. I was taken by a friend in the late 1970s to a conference at George Washington University on the history of women in the American Revolution. I said, women in the American Revolution, be real.
Who knew, right?
Who knew? And I went, and I really, literally was a changed person from that. I loved history. It was so exciting. I heard about people like Deborah Sampson Gannon, who was the first woman wounded in the Revolutionary War after she disguised herself as a man, and they only found out she was a woman after she was wounded, and the doctor had to dress her wounds. I learned about Betsy Ross, who I thought was one of the few women I learned about in history. However, she, it turns out, didn't just sit in her rocking chair and sew. She was actually sewing to support her family, having lost husbands, more than one, and that she was an entrepreneur, that she had invented a way to fold the cloth so that she could get a perfect five-pointed star with one cut of the scissors. Okay, and after that illumination, which was shocking to me, I went back to the Maryland Commission for Women, where I was serving, and said, we need to do something about this. We really need to highlight all these things, all these invisible women that we'd never learned about. Not just big names, but all the women in our communities.
What year was that? Do you remember?
That was 1979. And we then, Joanne Orlinsky, who still serves on the Maryland Heritage Center Board, was the chair of the Maryland Commission for Women at the time. The commission voted unanimously to approve a women's history project, and Joanne and I went to the Maryland State Department of Education and met with David Hornbeck, who was then superintendent of schools, and asked for the coordination and cooperation partnership with the Maryland State Department of Education. So from the beginning, it was a partnership between the Maryland Commission for Women and the Maryland State Department of Education.
Because clearly it's to the benefit of students, because they didn't know these stories any more than we did.
Right.
So that was very smart to get the State Department of Ed involved so early.
Yes. Plus, we wanted the students to learn, and who else could get things into the schools than the State Department of Education? We could get it to the local commissions for women from the commission, but we couldn't get it into the schools. And so it was important strategically and important content-wise. Linda, I know that you remember this because we've been working together a long time, even before this project. Remember when your daughter Beth was 4 years old and wrote material for the Women's Political Caucus newsletter. You remember this?
Right, and she was really the first one that started working on women's history. And as she grew up and began teaching, she started a women's studies course that was the first one in the state of Maryland that was being used by all the school teachers in her county.
which you must be very proud about.
Absolutely.
I am.
So there are so many secondary stories like that of, something happened when you all began in Prince George's County and all your partners that you had there that expanded to the statewide, and each of your people had a special outcome that expanded the Women's History Project and the women's knowledge of women's history, and eventually the Hall of Fame and other aspects.
Yeah, and it's thrilling to see the next generation carrying on.
It's all important for sustainability that we're all working for. More stories to tell.
Well, one I'd really like to tell you was how we began the project. You know, we did it during March because it's Women's History Month, and that was just started in 1980. Around March 8th, because March 8th was when the women in the Garment Workers District in New York went on strike because of women fighting against the 12-hour workday, abusive employment of children, and health care and so forth. And that was why March 8th was the day that the month was chosen. That was 1857.
Wow.
Then it became Women's History Week in 1980 and 1987, thanks to Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland.
Right.
She was a chief sponsor. It became Women's History Month. But when we began the project, and Linda remembers this,
I do.
Yeah.
it was in the days before we had internet, before we had computers. We had no funding, as most women's projects are, and I don't know if you want to talk about how we were able to do the kits without any of that equipment or funding.
We didn't have any funding at the time for kits, resource kits we could send to all the schools, but we got the Maryland State Department of Education, Commission for Women, and some private funders from women's organizations to be willing to help us create materials that would go to all the schools. So Jill can tell you how we decided what to put in them.
Actually, the other thing too, there were so many people, I remember too, because that you had such a great committee of people working on special topics that, as Linda was saying, there was just so much interest, and a lot of volunteer people went into it. So, yeah.
The committee that we formed was really important because it represented historians, it included men, it included Maryland Instructional Television for videos, which was then at the State Department of Education. It included people from every group, the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, on Hispanic Affairs, on African American Affairs, and the Rehabilitation Center because of including people with disabilities. So this is a good point to share with you. The logo we developed to have for the Maryland Women's History Project. This was our original logo, and great thought and care went into it. We were very careful. If you look at the logo, you'll see that we included people of various ages, periods of time, racial groups, and we included a person with a disability sitting in a wheelchair. But because people with disabilities are so often seen as passive, we put this person sculpting, being a sculptor, so that there was action. And so this gives you some sense of the degree of thoughtfulness we put into inclusion. We even had the Maryland State Black-Eyed Susan in there for that. This was really important to us.
And you set the stage because now, in 2019, many jurisdictions and school systems have part of their philosophy and part of their mission is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you were far ahead of your time, but set that standard.
Yeah.
So we're so grateful for that.
We're grateful you were working with us.
That's right.
So I guess I want to say also that the whole point of inclusion is those names, those invisible people, as Lucille Clifton said, and we use her quote, our famous poet laureate, where she said, "Where are the names of those women I would have walked with?" It's important to acknowledge the women, not just in the Hall of Fame and big things, but the women who, to make these kits, were not just Linda and me in the committee. It was Dolores Street, and it was Vicki Wilson, and it was Maggie Green, and it was Barbara Welsh, the people who were the secretaries in the offices at the State Department of Education and the Commission for Women, who did the typing. We didn't have a computer. You couldn't slip it out. If there was one error, they had to do it all over
Scraps
again.
of paper. And
They worked with such devotion because they really believed in the importance of what we were trying to finally illuminate and recognize. And I think when we remember names, it's not just the people who are out front, but especially because of the invisibility of the roles that women have performed forever, that those people's names, why I name them, is that those people's names also ought to be before people.
I think another aspect that's so important that was involved in those packets that you were doing, or everybody was doing, it was the early days of showing role models that led to different career pathways for a lot of young girls. So I think that's another benefit, that besides sharing the history, was also opening up workforce and career exploration opportunities for women and girls that they just had not really considered themselves. It was a big effort then for working in non-traditional jobs and careers, but you just don't do that without the background of seeing yourself in those roles as well. So it's another byproduct of what
And we
you were
felt
doing.
it as a passion, Linda.
That's right, we had what we called Unsung Heroines, so it wasn't just people that became famous, but every kid focused on a different subject area. Maybe it was science, math, the arts, and it was a pleasure to have committees that would go out and find people, women in Maryland, that were doing important work but might not have become famous.
Yeah. And the first year, which was before we had any real kits, we had to run everything off on a Xerox machine for the hundreds of schools in the state, for all the public libraries in the state, and they had to be run by hand and collated by hand because we didn't have collating even at that time. And because we had no money, we were able to, but we had permission to use the copy machines, and of course they were busy during office hours. So Vicki Wilson and Dolores Street and I would go in at night at 4:30 when the offices were closing. We would start copying, and we would start copying as many kits as we could until we faded on a given day. Then, this is the best story. This was on one Friday. Vicki and I were working late copying. It was a Friday evening, and you know state office buildings kind of vacate at the end of Friday, and people usually don't come back till Monday. We left. It was dark. We went in the elevator to go back and go home. The elevator lost power.
Oh, no.
Vicki and I were stuck in a dark elevator in the middle of a state office building on a Friday evening. We were sure we were going to be there all weekend.
That's before cell phones, too.
We had no cell
No
phones.
yeah.
None of the buttons on the elevator worked. And Vicki and I are sitting in the elevator trying to see, like in the movies, can we climb out here? Anything to push? Nothing. And the two of us were sure, after some time went by, we hoped when they found our bodies Monday morning that they would know we were the first martyrs for Maryland women's history. But that was our beginning, and from there we ran those off, and we had that first kit.